Hello, I'm Dennis Bevington. I'm the Member of Parliament from the Northwest Territories, and I'm pleased to be with you here today. And as well, I'm with my colleague from Sault-Ste-Marie, Tony Martin, who's the NDP party critic for Human Resources. We're here today and we want to have a discussion about the nature of poverty throughout Canada and the Northwest Territories. Poverty affects many people in my constituency. We have some of the highest cost of living in the country. We have very remote communities. Many of those communities have high and unacceptable levels of unemployment. People in those communities are many times not able to make ends meet. Poverty takes many forms. It can be among the elderly, it can be among the disabled, it can be among the unemployable who simply can't fit into today's society. There's also a class of poverty called working poverty, where people who work honestly every day to make a living simply cannot make ends meet. Wages are low, cost of living is high. Those types of things have led us to a state of poverty that exists across this country, and I'd like to have my colleague, Tony, perhaps talk a little bit about how ingrained that poverty is across the country and how that impacts people from coast to coast to coast.
Well, Dennis, thank you, and thanks for this opportunity. I mean, there's nothing I feel more passionately about, as you know, than the challenge of eradicating poverty in this country. And that's because I believe, and certainly many people across this country believe, that government has no more greater a responsibility, fundamental responsibility, than to take care of those who are most at risk and marginalized within its jurisdiction. And certainly in this country, if you look at some of the reports that have come out, and there have been two just recently, one from Campaign 2000 and another one from Food Banks Canada, that indicates that we have a continuing stubborn poverty in this country that hovers around 10% of our population, that just doesn't seem to be dealt with in an effective manner. I mean, you know, we've just been through, if you look before the recession, of 2008, some of the most economically prosperous times in our history, and yet we're still stuck, in this place of, families and people going without and not being able to afford the basics to live a life with dignity. And certainly, up in your area, and you were very responsible in having me up a couple of times. Once during a tour I was doing on my own, again in response to a territorial conference on poverty. And we also brought the Standing Committee on Human Resources and Social Development, who were doing over the last 3 years a comprehensive study of the federal role in a national anti-poverty strategy. And we heard, from many people, that many of them that you brought to the table in the territories, say to us that in the Northwest Territories, two groups in particular struggle mightily with the challenge of making ends meet. And that's women. Particularly single women, who, and end up, out of the house or whatever, looking for housing, and Aboriginal people in some of the more remote communities.
Well, Tony, you brought forward a bill now, your private member's bill, C-545, to offer solutions to eradicate poverty in this country. Maybe you could kind of touch on those a little bit, and we can hear your thoughts on some of those processes.
Yeah, well, the federal government, for all intents and purposes, walked away from this very important area of public business in 1995, when the then Liberal government got rid of the Canada Assistance Plan. And since then there's been no framework, there's been no national strategy or imperative to get rid of poverty or decrease poverty. They walked away and they removed resources, significant resources, which left the provinces and municipalities and First Nations, hole in the bag and really finding it difficult, because we've gone through a series of ups and downs since that time. So I thought and felt very strongly after my consultation across the country that it was important that we, in some legal way, require the government to come back to the table, and then in doing that, give them a framework out of which they can operate, some of the tools that they would need. It's not prescriptive. It's very much an empowering piece of legislation that basically gives the federal government the legal requirement, plus indicates what some of the tools might be, but encourages them, or actually lays out a pattern and a timeline for conversations with the provinces, territories, and First Nations in putting a plan together.
Now, with elderly, you know, I hear this right across the territory that where the cost of living is so high, the elderly still receive only the same pension as the rest of Canadians. Okay. Is that pension for the rest of Canadians adequate? Should we see changes to the pension that would recognize the high cost of living that these elderly people have in my communities?
Yeah. Well, the Canada Pension Plan and the way that it rolled out with the old age security and the GIS is a perfect example of how on one hand a government can do something that can lift absolutely everybody out of poverty. I mean, back in the 60s, when you looked at seniors, many of them, too many, were living in some pretty desperate circumstances. We brought in the Canada Pension Plan. We were told at the time we couldn't afford it, but it turns out we could. It was the right thing to do. Then we brought in the OAS and then the GIS, which has lifted many seniors out of poverty across this country, but we're now starting to fall behind. Those programs are no longer adequate, particularly when you look at what's happening in the economy itself and the demise of many of the private sector pension plans that were out there and how they're being impacted. We really do need to look at, we've got thousands and thousands of seniors now finding it very difficult to stay in their homes, for example.
Now, when it comes to the working poor, because I know this is a subject that we don't often hear about in Canada, but really there's many people that simply can't make a go of it. Is the answer? What's the answer there? Is it higher wages? Is it better support for public education? What is it?
Well, I think it's a combination of things, and certainly the City of Toronto, with leadership by the United Way, did a study just about 3 or 4 years ago that indicated, because many of the new Canadians who show up on our shores end up in the big cities like Toronto, that literally hundreds of thousands of people now, the working poor, get up in the morning, work every day, 24/7, all year long, and still live in some pretty desperate circumstances and poverty. There's a number of things. Certainly minimum wage, topping up the wages that people get, making sure that we have those programs in place like child care and health care and education programs that make it less expensive for them on some ends to provide for their family and for their children. So there's a combination of things. There's no magic answer there, but there's a whole lot of things, all of them contained, frankly, in the report that was tabled just recently in the House of Commons by the Standing Committee on Human Resources and Social Development.
Well, I'd encourage everyone that's listening to this to take time and look at that report that was done by the Standing Committee, which was supported by all the parties on that committee and which has been brought forward to Parliament. That has answers, and that we need the public to rally around this type of activity and give Tony and those other people that are working hard in Parliament to try to deal with these poverty issues support in moving ahead and in making it possible for us to deal with the poverty issues. I'm really thankful that you had a chance to talk with you today, Tony, and I wish you all the best with your future work in this vital area for our country.
Well, thank you, Dennis.